It is January 10th, 2026, Simonstown Naval Base, South Africa, where the Indian Ocean meets the Atlantic Ocean, the crossroads of the southern world. On the dock, naval officers march in formation for the opening parade of a military exercise. The flags behind them tell a story: South Africa, China, Russia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates. And watching from the sidelines as official observers, not participants, but present and paying very close attention, representatives of Brazil, Egypt, Indonesia, and Ethiopia. The exercise is called Will for Peace 2026. The name was chosen by China. In the water off the dock, a Chinese guided missile destroyer, the Tangshan, armed with 64 vertical launch cells, capable of firing long-range surface-to-air and anti-ship cruise missiles. Alongside it, a Russian corvette that NATO warships shadowed all the way from the Baltic Sea past the English Channel down the length of the African continent. 3 Iranian warships, including vessels belonging to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, and a South African frigate, the Amatola, hosting them all. It is the first naval exercise ever conducted under the banner of BRICS. It is led by China. It is happening at the exact geographic point where anyone seeking to control the maritime routes between Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas would choose to position themselves. And it is happening 6 months after the President of the United States threatened every country in the BRICS bloc with tariffs, called them anti-American, and said, from the Truth Social account of the most powerful man in the world, that any nation aligning with BRICS will be charged an additional 10% tariff. There will be no exceptions. This is not a story about a routine naval drill. This is a story about whether the world is splitting in two, and where Brazil, a democracy of 215 million people and one of the largest economies on Earth, is choosing to stand. Tonight, we are going to tell you everything. The drill that sent shockwaves through Washington, the tariff threat that lit the fuse, the Brazilian president who told Trump the world does not want an emperor, the Iranian ships that turned a naval exercise into a diplomatic disaster, the Indian absence that reveals the fault lines running through the BRICS bloc itself. And the deeper question that all of it raises: is BRICS becoming something genuinely new, something that resembles, in outline, if not in name, a military alliance? And if so, what does that mean for the world order that the United States has led and funded and defended for 80 years? Stay with us. To understand what happened at Simonstown in January 2026, you have to go back 6 months to a ballroom in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, on the evening of July 6th, 2025. Brazil was hosting the 17th annual BRICS Summit, the most important in the bloc's history by the assessment of virtually every analyst covering it. For the first time, all 10 member nations were gathered together. The original 5 founding members, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, plus the 5 new members who joined in 2024 and 2025, Egypt, Ethiopia, Indonesia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates. 10 partner countries were also represented, including Cuba, Bolivia, and Malaysia. The room represented more than 40% of the world's population and nearly a third of global GDP. Brazil's president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, had invested enormous political capital in this summit. He had spent his presidency pushing BRICS toward what he called a genuine alternative architecture for global governance. Not anti-Western, he insisted, but genuinely multipolar. A world in which developing nations had real voice in the institutions that governed trade, finance, health, and climate. A world, in his framing, organized around people and development rather than great power competition. On Sunday, July 6th, the BRICS leaders released their joint declaration. It was careful, measured, deliberately diplomatic in its language. It condemned unilateral tariff and non-tariff measures without naming the United States. It condemned military strikes against Iran without naming Israel or America. It called for reform of global financial institutions. It backed cross-border payment systems in local currencies, a step toward reducing dollar dependence in trade among BRICS nations. It was, in the judgment of most analysts, a deliberately toned-down document, specifically designed to avoid provoking Washington. It provoked Washington anyway. At 11:26 p.m. on Sunday night, the first day of the summit, while the leaders of a dozen nations were still in Rio, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social, "Any country aligning themselves with the anti-American policies of BRICS will be charged an additional 10% tariff. There will be no exceptions to this policy. Thank you for your attention to this matter." The declaration had not named the United States. Trump named BRICS anyway. Within hours, the summit that had been carefully designed to project unity and moderation was instead the global news story of the day. Not because of anything the BRICS leaders had said, but because the President of the United States had characterized their annual diplomatic gathering as an anti-American act requiring financial punishment. The response from the BRICS leaders was immediate, and it crystallized, in a matter of hours, the fault lines that define this entire confrontation. Brazil's Lula da Silva was direct. "The world has changed," he told reporters. "We don't want an emperor. We are sovereign countries." He called Trump's remarks reckless. He said the tariff threat hadn't even been raised during their meetings that day. It wasn't an issue, he said, because BRICS nations refused to let it become one. It's not right for a president of a country the size of the United States to threaten the world online, he said. South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was more measured, but no less pointed. "I think there needs to be greater appreciation of the emergence of various centers of power in the world, and this should be seen in a positive light rather than in a threatening light." China's foreign ministry spokesperson said Beijing opposed any action using tariffs as a tool to coerce others. Russia's Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov denied that BRICS worked to undermine other countries. BRICS, he said, was, quote, "a group of countries that share common approaches and a common worldview on how to cooperate based on their own interests." India and Brazil did not immediately issue official responses. They were hosting and attending a summit. They were focused on the agenda. But behind the scenes, the message that Trump's post sent to every leader in that room, to every diplomat at every table, was unmistakable. The United States had just told a gathering of nations representing 40% of the world's population that their very membership in a diplomatic forum was grounds for economic punishment. Days later, Trump went further. In a cabinet meeting, he said, "If they're a member of BRICS, they're going to have to pay a 10% tariff just for that one thing, and they won't be a member long." Won't be a member long? The suggestion, explicit and remarkable, was that the United States could pressure nations out of an international organization they had chosen freely to join. Now, let's be precise about what BRICS actually is, because the gap between what Trump called it and what it actually is may be the most important fact in this entire story. BRICS is described by its own members as a political and diplomatic coordination forum. It supports economic, political, and social cooperation. It was founded in 2001 with the purpose of serving as a forum for emerging economies to cooperate on key issues such as trade, security, and diplomacy. It has a development bank. It has regular summits. It has rotating presidencies. It does not have a military command structure. It does not have a mutual defense treaty. It does not have an Article 5. It is not NATO. Russia's own government stated explicitly in response to questions about Will for Peace 2026 that BRICS was never conceived as a military alliance, and there are no plans to transform it in that direction. This is the position of BRICS's most militaristic member, a country currently waging a full-scale war in Europe, explicitly walking back any framing of BRICS as a military bloc. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, at a previous summit, warned fellow members to be careful to ensure that this organization does not acquire the image of one that is trying to replace global institutions. The bloc is, by the assessment of CNN's analysis, a geopolitical hodgepodge made up of authoritarian nations, vibrant democracies, and countries in between. It includes close U.S. partners like India and the UAE. It includes countries that consider the United States an adversary, like Iran. It includes nations that don't see eye to eye with each other. India and China have an active territorial dispute, complete with soldiers who died in a border clash in 2020. The UAE and Iran have profound religious and political differences. Egypt and Ethiopia are locked in a dispute over Nile River water rights, severe enough that some analysts have warned it could lead to armed conflict. This is not a bloc with a unified military doctrine. It is a bloc united primarily, as the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace put it, by a shared view that the global balance of power skews too much toward the United States and its European allies, and that the system should be reformed. Not destroyed, reformed. That distinction matters enormously. And it is precisely the distinction that Trump's Truth Social post erased. Now let's talk about Brazil specifically, because Brazil is the country whose position is most revealing and most misunderstood in this entire story. Brazil is a founding member of BRICS. It hosted the 2025 summit. Its president publicly rebuked Trump to his face, or rather to his Truth Social feed. And when the Will for Peace 2026 naval exercise took place in January, Brazil sent observers. Not warships, not sailors, observers. That distinction between full participation and observer status is not cosmetic. It is the entire substance of Brazil's position, and it reflects a careful, deliberate, strategic calculation that Lula da Silva has been making throughout his presidency. Brazil under Lula has positioned itself as a voice for the global South, for developing nations that want genuine representation in international institutions, that resent the historical paternalism of Western-led financial systems, that see BRICS as a vehicle for collective bargaining power they would never have individually. Lula has been explicit. BRICS is not anti-American. It is not a military alliance. It is a forum for countries that want a different kind of world order, focused, as he keeps saying, on people and development, not conflict. At the same time, Brazil has been scrupulously careful not to cross lines that would genuinely rupture its relationship with the United States. Brazil trades extensively with the United States. Brazil's economy depends on access to dollar-denominated financial systems. Brazil sent observers to Will for Peace 2026, not destroyers. Brazil has maintained its claim of non-alignment, even as it has pushed back forcefully against American pressure. Trump, for his part, had already threatened Brazil separately. In addition to the BRICS tariff threat, he threatened 50% tariffs on Brazil specifically if it did not stop the prosecution of former President Jair Bolsonaro, whom Trump considers a political ally. Trump called the case against Bolsonaro a witch hunt. Lula did not back down. Brazil's legal system continued, and Brazil remained in BRICS. This is what strategic sovereignty looks like for a middle power in the Trump era. Navigating between a U.S. president who uses tariff threats as a foreign policy instrument and a BRICS framework that includes Russia, Iran, and China, while trying to maintain the independence and credibility to be taken seriously by both sides. It is an extraordinarily difficult position, and Brazil is not alone in occupying it. Let's talk about what actually happened at Simonstown and why it turned almost immediately into what the maritime executive called a diplomatic disaster. The exercise was originally called Mosey 3, the third in a biennial series of South African-hosted naval drills with China and Russia. The first was in November 2019. The second was in February 2023, which South Africa hosted on the exact first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, a decision that drew fierce Western criticism. The third was rescheduled from November 2025 when it conflicted with the G20 summit that South Africa was hosting. The United States did not send delegates to that G20. The rebranded exercise was given a new name, a new framework, and new invitations extended to all BRICS member navies. The name Will for Peace 2026 was chosen by China. And then Iran arrived. 3 Iranian warships entered False Bay, the corvette Iris Nagdi and 2 converted oil tankers serving as logistics vessels, Iris Makron and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy Expeditionary Sea Base Iris Shahid Madavi. Iranian personnel participated in dockside parades and inter-Navy sports events during the first 2 days of the exercise. Iranian media described the event not merely as a training opportunity, but as, in their words, a security structural strategy that allows Iran to independently, domestically, scientifically, and practically enhance its military capability. The United States was furious. Washington heavily criticized South Africa for hosting Iranian ships for joint drills. The pressure was immediate and intense. South Africa's president had, according to reporting, previously signaled to Iran that its participation was unwelcome. But the ships came anyway. And once they were in South African waters, once the IRGC's Expeditionary Sea Base was anchored off Simonstown, photographed by South African defense journalists, and picked up by international media, the diplomatic fallout was unavoidable. South Africa's government, caught between its stated non-aligned foreign policy and the reality of Iranian warships participating in exercises it was hosting, blinked. Before the seagoing phase of the exercise commenced on January 13th, the South African government formally requested that the Iranian ships withdraw from active participation and become observers instead. Iran acceded to the request. The Iranian vessels stayed in South African waters, but did not participate in the live fire and operational phases of the exercise. South Africa established a board of inquiry to investigate how Iranian participation had been allowed to proceed to the point it did. The Democratic Alliance, the second largest party in South Africa's parliament and a member of its coalition government, demanded a full parliamentary briefing. South Africa's entry into BRICS was for purely economic purposes, the party stated, and not to challenge or undermine the rules-based international order through blatant and armed antagonism provoked by disloyal military exercises. Chris Hattingh, the party's defense spokesman, called the presence of Russian and Iranian warships in South African waters a clear political signal. These are sanctioned states involved in active conflicts and serious human rights abuses, he said. Allowing them to conduct military exercises in South African waters sends a clear political signal, whether the government admits it or not. South African defense analyst Darren Olivier, director of African Defense Review, was blunt about the strategic error. Adding Iran, a pariah state still under United Nations sanctions and an associated arms embargo, has given South Africa a huge foreign policy headache at a time it can least afford one. One of the many problems with embracing pariah states is that they taint you by association, often intentionally so, as a way to bolster their own credibility. South Africa's Deputy Defense Minister, Bantu Holomisa, tried to defuse the controversy. Let us not press panic buttons because the USA has got a problem with countries. Those are not our enemies. But the panic buttons in Washington and in Pretoria's own coalition government were already pressed. Now let's talk about what the exercise actually revealed, setting aside the diplomatic chaos around Iran's participation. Because the operational content of Will for Peace 2026 is genuinely significant, regardless of the politics surrounding it. The exercise ran in 2 phases. The first, January 9th to 12th, was port-based. Opening ceremonies, ship tours, professional exchanges, cultural events, sporting competitions between naval crews. The second phase, January 13th to 15th, moved to sea. Communications exercises, formation maneuvers, maritime strike drills, hostage rescue operations simulating the seizure of a civilian vessel, and medical evacuation by helicopter. China contributed the destroyer Tangshan, a Type 052DL guided missile destroyer, a lengthened variant of the Luoyang 3 class, with a 64-cell vertical launch system capable of firing HHQ-9 long-range surface-to-air missiles and YJ-18 anti-ship cruise missiles, alongside the replenishment ship Taihu, with an embarked helicopter and special operations personnel. These ships had departed Qingdao in October 2025 as part of China's ongoing anti-piracy escort missions in the Gulf of Aden. China brought its best operational hardware to this exercise, not its second-tier vessels. Russia's Stoiky, a Steregushchi-class corvette from the Baltic Fleet, had been at sea since October 2025, transiting the length of Europe under NATO surveillance the entire way. HMS Severn of the Royal Navy shadowed it through European waters. The Stoiky's transit itself was a statement, Russia demonstrating it could move a warship from the Baltic to the South Atlantic, past NATO's entire eastern flank, and nobody could stop it. The exercise included live-fire drills against surface and aerial targets, maritime strike operations, special forces operations, counter-terrorism and counter-piracy scenarios. The full operational toolkit of a modern naval force, practiced jointly, with Chinese officers leading. It was, in the assessment of analysts at Military Africa, a strategic evolution of what had been purely bilateral exercises into a multilateral naval architecture. And perhaps most significantly, the PLA Navy had already invited participants to Shanghai for the final planning conference of the next BRICS Plus naval exercise, indicating, as the analysis put it, that this multinational maritime architecture will continue to expand. India's official position? The exercise was, quote, entirely a South African initiative and not an official BRICS activity. India's government spokesperson Randhir Jaiswal said the exercise involved only some BRICS members and was, quote, neither regular nor institutionalized within the bloc's framework. This framing, that the exercise was South African, not BRICS, was India's way of declining without formally opposing. It was a message to Washington. We are in BRICS for economic and diplomatic reasons, not military ones. We are not in China's military framework. We are not aligning with Russia's war machine. We are India, and we make our own choices. That message is complicated by India's own relationship with Trump. The Trump administration had imposed 50% tariffs on Indian goods, the highest of any major U.S. trading partner. India's purchase of Russian oil was among the biggest flashpoints in U.S.-India bilateral relations, with a trade deal hanging in the balance. In some sense, India was navigating the exact same impossible position as Brazil, deeply integrated into the existing Western-led economic order, deeply resentful of being lectured and pressured by Washington, deeply committed to maintaining the strategic autonomy that is the cornerstone of Indian foreign policy since Nehru. The difference is that India made its will for peace calculation differently than Brazil. Brazil sent observers, present but not participating. India stayed away entirely. Two founding members, two different calibrations of the same strategic dilemma. This sharp contrast between Brazil's observer status and India's complete absence immediately created uncertainty about where BRICS's center of gravity actually lies, and who, within the bloc, is genuinely willing to follow China's military lead. Let's step back and ask the question that this entire story is building toward. Is BRICS becoming a military alliance? The Diplomat's analysis, published January 28, 2026, the most thorough independent assessment of Will for Peace 2026, called it a symbolic development toward the possibility of emerging security and defense cooperation within the BRICS forum. Not an alliance, not yet, a possibility. A symbolic step. Al Jazeera's analysts noted that there are key differences between countries in BRICS Plus, like the UAE and Iran, or Egypt and Iran, that make a formidable military alliance practically impossible. The internal contradictions of the bloc are not cosmetic, they are structural. A bloc that includes both Iran and the UAE, both India and China, both Saudi Arabia and Iran, cannot easily agree on military doctrine or operational command. But here's what the skeptics of the BRICS military alliance framing may be missing. An alliance, in the formal NATO sense, may not be the right frame at all. What China appears to be building, exercise by exercise, invitation by invitation, planning conference by planning conference, is something more fluid and more dangerous. A network of military interoperability. Ships that have trained together, officers who have communicated together, procedures and protocols that have been rehearsed together. Not a treaty, not a command structure, but a web of practiced relationships that can be activated partially, selectively, temporarily, whenever circumstances call for it. Russia and China have conducted joint naval exercises in the Pacific with increasing regularity. China and South Africa have now exercised together 3 times. China and Iran exercised together in the Gulf of Oman in 2023. The individual exercises don't constitute an alliance, but the cumulative web of operational relationships they are building represents something that matters, regardless of what you call it. The Globe and Mail's analysis put it directly. The South African government's decision to host these exercises under the BRICS framework may have been alignment by stealth, not a deliberate policy to create a military bloc, but a drift toward operational entanglement that is easier to slide into than to reverse. What does Washington actually fear from BRICS? Trump's Truth Social post called BRICS anti-American, but it did not specify which policies. When pressed, administration officials and analysts pointed to 3 specific concerns. The first is de-dollarization, the BRICS effort to expand trade in national currencies rather than the US dollar. Currently, more than half of global transactions are denominated in dollars. Dollar dominance is not just financial prestige. It is the mechanism through which the United States can impose sanctions, freeze assets, and exercise economic coercion. If a significant portion of global trade shifts to yuan, rupees, reals, and rubles, even gradually, the United States loses a tool of foreign policy power that it has used for decades. The lofty goal of a shared BRICS currency is, in the assessment of most economists, practically impossible. But expanding trade in national currencies is not impossible, and BRICS nations have been explicitly backing that goal. The second concern is institutional displacement. The use of BRICS's new development bank and potentially new BRICS financial mechanisms to provide financing for developing countries without the governance conditions that the IMF and World Bank typically attach. If BRICS can offer loans and infrastructure investment without democracy requirements, anti-corruption conditionalities, or geopolitical alignment expectations, it becomes an attractive alternative for exactly the kinds of countries that the United States has historically influenced through its control of the existing international financial architecture. The third concern, newly emerging, is the military dimension that Will for Peace 2026 represents. Not a formal alliance, but a demonstration that China can organize joint military operations under a BRICS banner at a strategically critical geographic location, with ships from Russia and Iran alongside. And that Brazil and Egypt and Indonesia watched, and did not walk away. What does this mean for ordinary people in Brazil, in South Africa, in the United States, who aren't tracking naval exercises in the South Atlantic, but who will feel the consequences of what is being decided in these waters? In Brazil, the immediate stakes are economic. Brazil's economy depends on trade with both the United States and China. Trump's tariff threats, the BRICS 10%, the Bolsonaro 50% threat, and the broader tariff regime create real financial uncertainty for Brazilian exporters, for the Brazilian real, for Brazilian workers in industries from soybeans to aircraft manufacturing. Lula's defiance of Trump is politically popular at home. The "we don't want an emperor" line went viral across Latin America. But it also carries economic risk. Thank you for watching.